Okay, in this lesson we're going to go back into the rendered frame window and take a look at a few of the different settings and features that we alluded to in some of our earlier lessons. All right, so we have a couple of different features as far as the auto region selected and rendering subsets within 3ds Max. So the first is the auto region selected, and pretty self-explanatory. What this will basically do is create a rendering region automatically around whatever object we have selected. So if we were to commit, turn on this auto region selected, and then select something like this sphere back in the corner. Right, now let's come in, render this out, and what we should see is that it will only render this area that's immediately surrounding the sphere. Right, so sometimes this can be sort of useful as far as basically automatically drawing some kind of a region, so that way we don't have to worry about coming in, manually drawing out some kind of a region, and continually moving that around within our scene if we have a lot of different areas that we want to render out. The only drawback, though, is that it really doesn't give you a whole lot of control as far as a specific renderable area. You can see it actually renders a pretty sizable area here, whereas with the manual region, we can define a very, very tiny spot for this to come in and re-render if we just want to keep focused on one very, very specific area. So, like I said, this can have a little bit of usefulness as far as being able to come in, just select an object, and then make sure that 3ds Max is only rendering kind of a small area around that. Although, like I said, depending on the object in your scene, it may wind up rendering a pretty large area. All right, now another feature that we have is this render subsets. Now what this will basically do is allow us to still render one particular object in our scene or one particular thing that we happen to have selected. So if we turn on render subsets and let's come in and select maybe something like this background piece of geometry. Let's render this out. You'll notice that a portion of these spheres actually did not get rendered out, whereas some of these actually did. Well, that's just because these areas actually did exist in the render before we just hit render. So if you recall from just a second ago, these areas were actually rendered out just a moment ago whenever we were talking about the auto region selected and things like that. Basically, the render subsets will only update the pixels that correspond to whatever object we have selected. So with this render subsets, let's say now we were to come in and begin making some adjustments to this material. So I'll select this background, press M on my keyboard to open up the material editor. Let's come in and start to make some adjustments to this checker map that I have plugged in. So let's say I were to come in and begin changing the colors on this. So we'll just make this really noticeably different. Okay, so something really, really different as far as the overall color scheme is concerned. Right now with this render subsets active, let's re-render this. And what it's actually done is only rendered the areas of this particular view that have to do with this material. What you may notice is that even though this material has changed now to something very, very bright, you can see that in the reflections of these spheres, that material actually did not update because it's not attempting to update these particular objects. So while this can be somewhat useful as far as just making sure that you are rendering just a specific portion of your scene, we have to be really, really careful because this is really not very accurate, especially if we're dealing with things like reflections and refractions. What we're getting is not a very accurate feedback of what the final render should look like. So if I were to clone this and turn off my render subsets, render this again, right, now you can definitely see the difference here between what we had before, especially in the reflections, where now we're starting to see the actual reflected result of this new recolored material. And before, whenever we were using the subsets, it was not refreshing that area. So again, definitely be careful whenever using the subsets because what you see is really not going to be a very accurate representation of what you would actually get. All right, now the last feature I want to talk about is the iterative render. Now this is one that we had alluded to in one of our earlier lessons whenever talking about the render production, and we had talked about this bottommost button, which was the active shade. We also have this feature that's right in the middle of this pull-out menu, which is the iterative render. We can also access this exact same feature through this pull-down menu down here. Now really the iterative and the production render, there's very, very little difference between the two. The only difference is that with the iterative render, it will ignore certain settings that we set up in the render setup. So the iterative render will ignore any kind of file output that we may have set. It'll also ignore any start and end frames that we may have set. And it will basically just render everything out as a single still image without any regard for some of these different aspects. Right? And so we talked about in our previous lesson how we can actually set some of those things as far as the render output, our start and end frames, things like that. The only difference, like I said, the iterative render will pretty much ignore those features or those particular settings. Beyond that, there's really almost no difference between the production and the iterative render. All right, so while it can be useful, especially if you already have some of these different things set as far as the start and end frame, and you don't want to risk accidentally overwriting any of those rendered frames the next time you render this out, just switches to the iterative, and you can make absolutely certain that if you need to render out a still frame, you won't risk actually accidentally overwriting some of these different settings, or some of these different files, I should say, that are going to be written out. Right, so let's look at a few of these different features found within the render frame window.